Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another webinar here. Dux, this is exciting. We get to talk about Office 365 again. Isn't this awesome?
Actually, it's on Microsoft 365, John. Didn't you get the
Oh,
memo?
right. I see it on the slide, Microsoft 365.
Well, good
Go
morning,
ahead.
good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And in the next hour, we're going to have a lot of great learnings in unpacking the guest user puzzle in Microsoft 365. We're going to walk you through what's the difference between an external user versus a guest user, what capabilities there are in Microsoft 365 to enable these, and what are some of the gotchas, as John will definitely walk us through all those things.
Yep, absolutely. And hi, everybody. Proud to be here with Dux once again as my partner in crime. My name is John Peluso. I'm the Chief Product Officer at AvePoint, also Microsoft Regional Director. And you can see my digits up here on the screen, so feel free to reach out. And we will, of course, make these slides available afterwards.
And for those I have not met, my name is Dux Raymond Sai. I serve as a Chief Brand Officer here at AvePoint and been so grateful to be working alongside John and being in this industry over the last 15 years. So with that, let's jump right ahead, John.
Yeah, so when we talk about pieces of the puzzle here, there's a lot of different pieces that all interlock with each other. So we're gonna take a look at all of them. And we're going to go in order here. So first, we're going to talk about the concept of guests in Office 365. It's important we understand this foundation. We're going to move on and talk about the concept of inviting guests, which is how guests are added to your Microsoft 365 tenant. And then we'll talk more specifically about the tactical things, groups and teams, how we can have guests there. External access to files and file sharing, how we can do that. And then we'll put you all together at the end and we will talk about how we can manage this at scale and really operationalize it. First, we need to understand the concepts, and then we can get in here and talk about how we run a program around this. But Dux, I thought it'd be interesting beforehand to start off just with, I don't know that I've seen rooms of people go at each other more around concepts lately than opening up or not opening up guest access. So let's start there. What are you hearing and kind of what's your feeling about this idea of collaborating externally in Office 365 applications?
So let me answer that question by telling you a story, John.
Okay.
Pre-COVID, I was speaking with one of our customers, CIO, and I was kind of tongue-in-cheek joking, but he was telling me, hey, we don't want external access. How do I shut it down? How do I make sure people can't do that in Teams, nor Office 365, all that? I just don't want external access or external collaboration. I go, look, it's very easy, right? So first thing you got to do is you got to shut down email, right? So you don't have external access. And maybe 10 minutes later, after you shut down email, shut down the internet. Because if you shut down email, people will find out a way on how they can work externally. Well, sounds funny, but from my perspective, I think there's a valid business reason why external collaboration should be enabled. Because if you don't do that, people will find other ways. And frankly, we do that already with email. And you just turn the other way when people use Box or Dropbox or G Drive, right? So
yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Dux. I mean, and I use that argument myself, sometimes even internally, right? When people get up in arms about external collaboration, and there is a reason, to put a little bit of concern here. You should be conscious about this. You should be diligent about it. But you're right. Every organization collaborates outside every single day. The question is, how do they do it? How much control do they have? And so that brings us to this first set of bullets here, which we can just sort of talk to a few that make sense. There is this fear that by letting people in to your tenant, right, you're in some way more open and more exposed than you otherwise might be. There's a kernel of truth in that, but not if you have a good management program for how you're managing guests. You do need to think about it though. One thing that's important to note, and I don't know how many people know this, when you start up a new Office 365 tenant, guest access and external sharing is turned on by default, okay? So it's not a question of turning it on, it's a question of managing what's there and understanding where you might want to turn some dials to the left or to the right over time. So you're right, Dux. Everybody collaborates externally all the time. Anything else in these points here that you think we should point out before we move on?
I think just this third bullet in under the reality, right, is once your data leaves your system, what control do you have?
Yeah.
And that's always been top of mind for not only for myself, but a lot of organizations I talk to is, look, I mean, on one hand, it's great, right? Where I can not only share a Word document internally or potentially externally, but through time, how do I know it's not being forwarded? Through time, how do I know if people are still accessing it or not? So that's, especially now where everybody's working remotely, where we're relying on the cloud, more and more, not only unstructured content is being produced, but a lot of critical information, confidential information are in those type of content.
Right. So I guess the takeaway from this initial set of slides is it's not really a question of should I or shouldn't I externally collaborate. It's how do I do it and how do I manage that process, right? And so we can move on now to some of the how. And I'll just say up front that there are many layers to a proper data protection strategy. Many layers, right? Today, we're only going to be talking about the specific guest user management and controls, but of course, there's data level controls and things like that. So even if data spills outside the organization, you can still protect it. We're not going to talk about all of the layers today of everything outside of the guest user management, but understand that there are other controls out there as well. I'll pause and say we should have mentioned it up top. We are watching the Q&A chat. So if anybody has questions, feel free to type those questions in the chat as you can. We'll take those questions if they're in line with what we're talking about. We'll pause and take them on. If not, we'll devote some time down at the end. We'll take any questions that we don't have in the logical flow at the end. Anything we don't get to, we can post up later on a blog or something. So please feel free to ask lots of questions. Okay.
And I do see some questions coming in. We'll answer this question. This is a good question, but as we go along, we hit to this point, we'll definitely tackle this.
Yep, absolutely. And there, we've got a question already that came in. Hey, do you think maybe segmenting off separate SharePoint sites for external collaboration versus others that don't have external collaboration, does that make sense? We're going to talk about SharePoint. I'm going to talk about SharePoint and OneDrive, so stick with me. We're going to get there. But even just talking about the guest settings, et cetera, there's a lot of complexity here. There's a lot of complexity. The good news is because there's a lot of flexibility and control that you do have. But when I started looking into this a couple of years ago, this whole guest concept, it was really confusing, Dux. And I got to tell you, I started poking around and I put up a demo tenant. I started poking around and I said, let me look at all the guest user settings. And I came into Azure Active Directory and I saw these settings. Clearly, these are guest user settings. Then I went off and I started to look in the SharePoint Admin Center and I saw some settings that look like this, clearly talking about external sharing. Then I went to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center and I saw some more external sharing settings. Then I went into another area of the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, saw some more sharing settings. And then I saw another interface with more. Then I saw another place where we can see external sharing settings. Then I went into the sites settings in the SharePoint Admin Center and I saw some more and some more and some more and some more and some more. And the reality is we've got to understand how all these things fit together. And so it can feel a little disjointed. I see a comment that it, this whole guest thing feels a little half-baked. It feels a little like all over the place. I think there's actually a pretty logical strategy here, but let's try to put it back together, okay? So the different layers of settings are in place so that we can really properly put together a guest access program that makes sense. And the first place that we'll talk about, Dux, is here at the center, which is going to be your core guest settings at all, right? Just guests in general, not even yet applied to any specific Office 365 service. And those are your Azure AD settings. After that, we'll look at your Office 365 wide settings. we'll look at your group settings, and we'll look at your SharePoint settings. And then finally, there's one more level down, which is your team settings, right? So there's many layers to this thing. Let's put it all together. Now, Dux, this gets to some of the comments that I also see in the chat, which is, what is a guest, right? We use the term guest, we use the term external, we use the term, external sharing, we say external access. Like, what's going on here?
Sure. I think we should start with a very fundamental, right? So let's first talk about external user versus the guest user. So for those not familiar, the concept of external user actually started way back in Skype for Business. And the idea is company A, like AvePoint, you can what's called federate with company B, let's say Microsoft. So essentially, the admins can set it up so that anybody in Microsoft, if they're federated with AvePoint, we can go back and forth and chat with each other. And really, it's a Skype for Business functionality, chatting, it's instant messaging, pretty much that's it. So the terminology there is external user. Now, the beauty of it is I can IM anybody from Microsoft and vice versa. However, the newer capabilities around team, like setting up a team, sharing files, all that stuff is not part of external user. So that's what external users are.
Yeah. So let's use some terminology here, because like every Microsoft 365 issue, we run out of vocabulary, and this is really a vocabulary problem. And when I talk to customers, I know as you do, Dux, one of the first things I try to do is get them to understand, okay, let's all get on the same page and make sure we're speaking the same language. Guest. I'll from now forward in the deck, I'm going to use a capital G when I say guest, because I mean something very specifically. I mean a guest as identified in Azure Active Directory, and we'll talk about what that means. What you were mentioning before, let's call external access, right? External access is kind of this new next gen Skype for Business Federation, and we'll see that when we get into the team settings. And then external sharing is generally how I refer to what happens in SharePoint Online and OneDrive. Now, Microsoft doesn't help us with this, because in some interfaces they mix up those terms, so it becomes really, really confusing. But in general, let's stick with that. And let's talk about this concept of a guest in Azure Active Directory B2B. And actually, Dux, I'm going to use your department as an example for this, right? Now, for many folks, especially folks that have been using SharePoint in the past, collaborating externally has always happened. We've always had methods to have people who are not part of our internal company collaborate with us, like on files and stuff like that, right? And so normally the way you would do this is I would have, let's say my organization is Contoso, and then I have a Fabricam partner, and Dux, maybe this is your a media company that your team is working with, right? And we need to work with them on some files, and this is going to be a long-standing project. So it was not uncommon to actually create in the Contoso directory what we used to call a V- account, right? And a V- account was an account in our directory for user B, and we called it V- because a lot of times you'd use that kind of signifier in the naming convention to indicate, hey, everybody, I know this person's in the directory, but they're not really part of the company. They're virtual, V-. And we would create an account for them in the directory. And then they could collaborate. They were part of our directory. This was a little bit messy, though, because like Dux would have to petition our IT department to create the account for this person. Dux would then have to get the name and the password, the username and the password for user B, and somehow his team would have to communicate that back to user B. Any login or authentication issues, password resets would be the responsibility of our IT team. And so not only was this not great from an operational standpoint, it was also not great because I now have two user Bs. I have the real user B, and I have the user B that I created in the Contoso directory. The problem here is that there's no actual connection between Contoso and Fabricam and user B in Fabricam, user B in Contoso. So if this guy gets kicked out of Fabricam, let's say he leaves the organization, he's still in my directory, right? He can still access my stuff. And so there's a security risk there as well. So not an optimal model. Dux, you already talked about this alternative method, which is even more common, which is where my user A starts emailing bunches of documents over, right? Certainly not real good for collaboration, no co-authoring possible here, lots of copies of documents, especially if I have lots of parties that are all collaborating in this way. And then, as you said, there's a great chance that that content can go somewhere and I don't even know where it's going, right? So this is also not a great model. So what we have in the modern versions of Azure Active Directory and in Microsoft 365 is a new model that leverages a technology called Azure Active Directory B2B. Now, don't look for it. You're not going to see anything in any interface labeled Azure Active Directory B2B, but Azure Active Directory B2B is the service that powers what I'm about to show you. It looks exactly like what we did before, right? We have Fabricam user B, and now I have a user B here in Contoso. The difference is this is not really a user that I create. What I create is a reference to user B back in Contoso. This is a different type of object. It's not a user object, it's a guest user object. So everybody in the tenant knows that this is a guest. The directory knows that it's a guest, right? And what's even cooler is that because this is not a real account, it's just a reference to account in another domain, I don't have to own their password. I don't have to own their authentication. I don't have to own any of that. When user B tries to get to, let's say, a SharePoint site or a team in my organization, what I'll do first is I'll say, hey, did you get authenticated back over here by Fabricam? Go back over here, get authenticated where you live, and then come back with that token and I'll let you in. So that's cool because I don't have to own that. It also means when user B is no longer at Fabricam, they can no longer access my tenant. So that's easy too. And the other advantage here is that because this is all leveraging Azure Active Directory capability, I can still put additional controls on user B logging into my environment. What happens, Dux, when you try to get to an AvePoint property? Let's say it's the first time you're logging on for the day, or you hadn't logged on in a while. What happens? You put your password in, you get authenticated, but then what happens?
The multi-factor, right?
Exactly, right?
So
You get a multi-factor challenge.
we can apply that for even guests. So
Even
John,
guests can get it. Yep.
I'm sure a couple of questions are coming in, and I
Yep.
think it's appropriate for this conversation is when you talk about Fabricam's directory, can you expand further? Do they have to be in Azure AD? Can they have a different authentication model or a different type of directory model?
Yeah, it's a great question. When we get into the settings, I'll break that question down a little bit. Yep, for sure.
The other question here is, you may not touch on this, but is there anything around this if they have a on-premises AD sync to their Azure AD as well?
Yeah, works just fine, right? Because this is all about cloud identities here, right? So it works just fine. If it doesn't matter if this guy's synced. As a matter of fact, I think most organizations are using some kind of ADFS anyway. They're mastering their identities in an on-prem AD, and then they're replicating those up. So it works just fine. No problems there. And the other thing that's cool about this is that Microsoft has a pretty generous licensing model for how guests work. So this is true of AD, all of the AD features. Also, as we'll see when we get into the Office 365 stuff, all of the Office 365 stuff. You get 5 guest accounts at no addition, or 5 guest users who can leverage your internally purchased licensing, right, at a 5-to-1 ratio. So one paid license gives you up to 5 guest accounts that can have similar functionality. So if you have one paid team license, you can have up to 5 guests with the same Teams license. Same thing with Azure AD. Conditional access requires some additional Azure AD licensing, 1 to 5. So it's a pretty generous ratio to allow you to do this with no additional cost. Just understand there's a couple limitations for guests. They don't have a OneDrive and they don't have a mailbox, right? Other than that, they get access to a lot of the same capabilities as the internal users for the licensing that you've purchased. I'm going to take a quick spin, Dux, into the environment here to show you how we set up Azure Active Directory for these guests. And what I'm going to do is just head over to the Office 365 Admin Center, which is here. And then I'm going to click Show All, and I'm going to go over to Azure Active Directory. And I've already opened that up here. Okay, so here's Azure Active Directory. I'm going to click one more time, Azure Active Directory. And again, remember I said don't look for Azure AD B2B, you're not going to find it. Well, here we go, right? So here's my external identities. This is how I set up my settings. And one more click over here to external collaboration settings. So the settings I want to talk about, there's a lot of settings here, but I'll focus in on a few for the sake of time. So there's a few things here that we want to talk about. One is that, and just to summarize this section, your environment may look a little bit simpler than this, but essentially it's possible in most organizations, guests have a slightly limited capability. Like for example, Dux, you and I are both part of we're guests in the Microsoft tenant, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we can't just start surfing the directory, looking up Satya and finding him and sending him some Teams messages, right? So it is possible to limit how much of the directory a guest can step through, right? In general, what most people want to do is limit you to only discovering people that you're already in groups and teams with, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that makes sense. But there's a couple of other settings here that I want to point out. This one here is going to be important. Now, I can't stress enough. Right now, we're at the Azure Active Directory level. Azure Active Directory on some level has no concept of Office 365. It's just a directory. So some of the terminology here may not make sense. For example, you see there's a members can invite option. What does that actually mean? This means that basically are guests ever allowed to be invited into the tenant, net new guests, by non-admins? If I have this set to no, regardless of any settings I set anywhere else today, only admins will be able to bring new guests into the directory, right? With this set to yes, we say, okay, at the Azure AD level, non-admins might be able to get new guests, but we'll see what the settings down below have to do with, right? Down at the Office 365 level. That's one important thing to be aware of. And then the other thing to be aware of is down here. So you can see what we can do at the Azure AD level is set up allow and deny lists for different domains. So in Dutch, you asked me before, like who can be added as a guest? Is there any way to set up restrictions? Do they have to have a corporate Azure AD identity? Essentially, they need to have either a Microsoft account or an Azure AD identity, is the short answer. Or I have to already account for them in other identity providers. And we won't get into that today, but I could add things like Google or Facebook or other identity providers, right? But what I want to focus on today is down here. You can see what I've done is I've set this up as a deny list and say AvePoint.com domain is not allowed to be part of, not to be a guest here in the Contoso environment. And so when I go and I try to add a new user, let's go over here to users. And I'm gonna, as an admin now, you notice the difference, new user, new guest user, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a new guest user, let's go ahead and try to add John, and I'll just do this very quickly. Let's do ducks. All right, when I go to invite you ducks, I should get a message, right? And so even as an admin, these allow deny lists are going to take effect. Now, back to the external identity settings, this is your most powerful way to limit who you will allow guests, who you will allow from a guest standpoint. I see a question in the chat, admins and users in the guest inviter role can invite. That's an astute question. This is the only way to turn guest access off. Well, to turn guest invitations off tenant-wide, right? So this is the biggest off switch you have.
So a couple of similar good questions while we're here, right? So somebody says, so let me understand. If we have 70 users with E5, does that mean we can accommodate 350 guests with all the functionality except Mailbox and OneDrive?
Yes, there are some limitations about what guests can do, but you're absolutely right. They can access Teams, they can access SharePoint, all that stuff.
What happens if, let's say, Dux from Fabricam leaves and he was a guest user in Contoso? Do you have to do anything with that guest?
No, we will get into how do we scrub guests out of the domain or out of the directory. If I go back over here and I look at my users again, and I put a filter on here and I say, all right, I just want to find the guest users, right? There's no automatic process that's going to remove guests from here. We'll talk about that at the end of the session, right? There's no process to get guests out of here. But remember, if they've left Fabricam, they can't ever log into Fabricam again. So even though I have their reference here, I'm still somewhat protected. Now, pruning these out is absolutely what we want to do. So we'll talk about that when we get to the operationalizing. So those are some of my Azure AD settings. But all we've done now is create the guest account, right? One concept I want you to take, two concepts, right? Limitations based on their domain, and number two, very important, invitations. Who can invite? I just want to go back and make sure I didn't turn invitations off for everybody, which will really screw up the rest of the demonstrations. Okay, good to go. So let's get back in here. So Ducks, a lot of ways to collaborate externally. You mentioned emailing. But now with groups and teams and sites, people generally understand how to send a file out, right? Personal OneDrives, right? Share a file. What does it mean to be able to have an external party actually in a team? I know your department specifically collaborates externally quite a bit. Talk to me about why team collaboration with guests is so fundamentally different.
Sure, absolutely. You know, a lot of us think, especially coming from SharePoint, right? We think collaboration is just central around documents, which is still important, but frankly, collaboration is more than documents. In the past, I would set up an external SharePoint site, but all the communications are still on email back and forth. But with Teams, the beauty is all the communications around that initiative is also contained in essentially in a team. So be it communication, document collaboration, all in one-stop shop, which is awesome. So for me, I'm in the marketing organization. We do a lot of initiatives internally and externally. So for example, when we want to do a big event in the past, not during COVID, we would hire an external party to help organize an events company. And there's a lot of back and forth between meetings and approvals and designs and videos, and it's just so much going on, and using email is not efficient. So that's when we would use Teams. Another scenario would be if we were collaborating, for example, with other groups in the organization. Now, while that may still be internal, but that group may bring in external parties as well. So there's tons of scenarios like that, and I'm sure in your organization, you're experiencing the same thing.
Yeah, very much the same. I think the easiest way to say this is exactly the same reasons why Teams is good for internal collaboration, makes it good for collaboration across. There are still times when all I need is someone's feedback and input on a single document or a set of documents. So it's not every time that I need them to be part of a team, right? But still, if it's ongoing long-term collaboration, I know in my team, technical integrations, we have white labels with other companies who white label our software. You can imagine the back and forth with that, and so Teams works great. So let me talk a little bit, and I'm going to get into, just go straight to a demo this time. Let's talk a little bit about how we set up groups and teams for external collaboration. And this is going to start to get weird, Duck. So let's be honest, right? Remember all of the settings we talked about, and these all are in a chain. So we started at the highest level, and there were a few questions about, can I have an allow and a deny list? No, you got to pick one or the other, right? It's got to be an allow or a deny list. And a little birdie told me that if you're going to do a deny list, I think you max out at about 60, right? So just be aware that there are some limitations in there. And let's get into it, right? So I'm going to go now back to my Microsoft 365 Admin Center because there's a few different places I've got to go. You remember our slide, we did Azure AD. Now I'm going to set some tenant-wide settings. Then I'm going to set some group settings. Then I'm going to set some team settings, right? In between there, we're going to have to set some SharePoint settings. So let's talk about it. The first place I'm going to go is over here in settings, and I'm going to come down to organizational settings. And the first place I got to go is over here in security and privacy. Remember, these will all be on by default. So if you want to understand where to go to turn things off and so you get a handle on it, this is also useful for that, right? So security and privacy, and we're going to come over here to sharing. Again, this is an Office 365 wide setting. So this one little checkbox is going to determine across SharePoint, Teams, groups, right? Can users add people outside the organization as guests? And do you remember back here, we had this members can invite slider. This is the one that allows non-admins to invite. Even if this is set to on, remember, this is at the Azure AD level, we have another layer of that setting here, which says, okay, now for Office 365, can non-admins ever invite? That's essentially what this is saying. So if you don't want non-admins inviting people, you can turn this off, right? It doesn't matter what setting you have in Azure AD, your non-admins will never be able to invite new guests through the Office 365 interfaces. That's one important setting.
Yeah, and one key thing people have to remember, especially at the Azure AD setting level, that affects pretty much your entire Microsoft Cloud investments, not just Microsoft 365.
Right.
So if you're doing some guest access capabilities at the Azure level or even Dynamics 365, the Azure AD is the mother of all settings.
Yep, absolutely. And the reason we're covering them in this order is because we're starting at the top and we're working our way down, right? So this one is all about anywhere in Office 365 can essentially owners invite guests, because Office 365 never lets members invite new guests. In some cases, members can add existing guests, right? Can share content with existing guests if they're in the directory, but this is all about net new add of guests to the directory.
So a couple of good questions, and I think this is important to, again, clarify and reiterate, right? So somebody was asking, so can I invite people without Microsoft accounts or Gmail accounts? Yes, however, at the main level, at the Azure AD level, earlier when John was showing you, at the Azure AD level, it has to be set up that your tenant would accept people with Gmail accounts, right?
Yep.
So that's one important point. And then at that point, if people are using Teams and they want to invite ducks@gmail.com, as long as the Azure AD level is set up, then you should be good.
Yep.
Next question, John, is what if we decide to cut our licenses? What's going to happen to those guests if we max it out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that there's any proactive enforcement here, but obviously you want to be in compliance with your license agreements for sure. Okay, good to go. Let's move on. So we've set the tenant level, can owners or non-admins invite. Let's go and set some other, let's go set the next two settings. For now, I'm going to stay in organizational settings, but now I'm going to go to the individual services. You see us working our way down the stack, right? And the first place I'm going to go is to Office 365 groups. Now, why is this such an important setting? Because Ducks, a team is really what?
Microsoft 365 group.
That's right. So I'm now at the Microsoft 365 group settings. Everything I set here will impact Microsoft 365 groups, but also teams, okay? And there are two settings here. Let group owners add people outside the organization to groups as guests. Does this sound like invite net new, Ducks, or does this sound like can you ever, as an owner, add a guest?
You can. Let
right?
group, yeah.
This is any guest, even an existing guest. So if I say, hey, look, I know that my company wants to do guest access for SharePoint, they want to do all this stuff, but I own Office 365 groups and teams, and I don't ever want guests in there, this is where you could turn it off, right? With that setting off, you will never let guests access, owners add guests to the team. They could still be added, but they'd have to be added by admins, right? And again, that covers net new and existing.
Another important point for everybody watching right now, you're not familiar with Microsoft 365 groups, formerly known as Office 365 groups. I encourage you to read up on it. That's a very critical component, especially on collaborative tools like Teams and SharePoint. We have tons of resources on that, but in the interest of time, we can't really go through all the details of Microsoft 365 groups.
Now, this second setting, Dux, is really weird, right? Because this box said, can guests be members of groups, yes or no? The second one looks a little weird, and basically it says, let guest group members access group content. What it actually is, this little tick box determines whether, even if I've enabled guests in the group, whether the guests can also get to the content that's stored by the group in SharePoint. Right, so every Office 365 group and every team is backed by a SharePoint site. With this disabled, I'd be allowed to have guests maybe as part of my group for email purposes, but they would not be able to access any content. I've
Sure.
yet to meet a customer that wanted this on and this off, but
Yeah.
just be aware, right? The other thing to be aware of is I'm going to go to a SharePoint setting next. If SharePoint settings say no guests, even if I have this tick box checked, the SharePoint setting is going to win. Okay, and I'll show you an example of that in a moment. So as I said, I got my group settings, I did my tenant settings for inviting, I did my group settings for can owners add groups to owners add guests to groups and teams. I'm going to come down one more place and I'm going to come to SharePoint. And what I'm setting here are my global SharePoint external sharing rules, right? So globally, what's the maximum I allow, right? What's the broadest external sharing that I want to allow? Now, you will have an opportunity later, site by site, to be able to have more conservative policies. But what you set here is going to be the least conservative policy that you're going to allow. It's not possible if I set this to only people in my organization to then go to a down level site and say, oh, I want this one less restrictive. Unfortunately, the way Microsoft works is you have to start at the least restrictive way, and then object by object, there is an ability to wind it down a little bit. Notice as soon as I selected that, I got an error message, not an error message, a warning message that says, hey dude, on the other screen, you said you did want groups to be able to or guests to be able to access group content, but if you continue with this setting, this is going to override that, right? So I'm going to leave this at new and existing guests. I don't want anonymous links. That's really dangerous, right? That means anybody with a link can sign in and access a file, even actually not even signing in. If they have a link, they can get to the file and they never even sign in. So that's pretty broad. We're going to leave this one at new and existing guests, and then we're good to go there.
So, John, question is, what kind of administrative roles people need to start configuring AAD and admin center like what you're doing?
Yep. So this is a global admin for these settings here, right? All these settings in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center is a global admin. In Azure Active Directory, you need to be an Azure Active Directory admin. And to be able to add guests as a non-Azure Active Directory admin, you need to be in a role called guest inviter, right? So there's a few different layers there. So we've handled Azure AD, tenant level, right? Settings for sharing, group settings for adding groups, for adding guests. Now we set SharePoint settings. The last place to go is down in Teams. And so now I have to go all the way to the Teams Admin Center. And the Teams one is a little bit weird too. Teams, I believe it's still the case, is the only one of these settings that is off by default. So what I do is I come over here to my Teams settings, actually my org-wide settings. And remember before, Dux, you were talking about external access? Don't be fooled, right? This is Skype for Business Federation, right? This is Skype for Business Federation. Don't be fooled by this. You want guest access. And there's one big slider here, on or off, right? On or off. And that's because most of the settings are handled, most of the important settings are handled back there in the group setting that I did before. So this is just, hey, can those folks also hit the Teams application, yes or no, right? And so it's a yes or no. If it's a yes, right, no, that's all there is to it. Yes, then all of these additional settings show up, which are really useful. Like, what can I do as a guest in a meeting? Am I allowed to use video? Am I allowed to share my whole screen? From a messaging perspective, am I allowed to delete my messages? One of the things that kills me in the Microsoft tenant, Dux, is we can't delete our messages, right? So you put a message in there and you realize you did something not so smart, You can't delete that message, right? Because that's part of their policy. So it is possible to treat guests differently here in Teams. So many layers of settings.
A couple of good questions, right? So this one, what's the benefit of allowing guest access tenant-wide? You set up AAD, but disabling it for groups, so that only affects Teams with nothing else. Well, there may be a couple use cases. So for example, you're not ready for Teams yet, but you want to do at a SharePoint site level, you want to do external sharing with SharePoint, then sure. Or OneDrive, for example. So those are some potential use cases.
Yeah. Also, again, remember, Azure AD can be used for many things beyond Office 365. Office 365 is just one consumer of Azure AD. There may be many, many others.
Is there any setting that allows anonymous sharing in OneDrive, but not in SharePoint? Or do I have to set it on the site collection level?
So let's dig into the weeds a little bit more, Doug. I want to cover two things for you, okay? The first thing I want to do is talk about this concept. We looked at groups and teams, and we saw there's a global setting about whether owners can add guests or not, right? But a very, very common use case is, hey, I don't want guests in this particular group, but they're okay in this particular group. Thus far, we've only done global settings for that affect the whole tenant. So it is possible, again, these slides are available, and I've put the link down below. It is possible to use a little bit of PowerShell to set particular teams to not allow new guests, okay? And so what I've done here is I've got a particular group called retail, which also happens to be a team, and I set it up to not allow guests, even though, as you saw, my tenant does allow guests in groups, right? And so what does that look like on the ground? It looks a little bit like this. So let's go in, and now I'm going to go in as a user, and let's take a quick look. Now I have in my tenant here, I've already set up a user called with my live.com account. So I'm going to add a member here. And let's hope this guy isn't already a member. There you go. I'm a guest. Add him to the team. Oh, he's already in there. Hey, Dux, let's add you. duxsci@gmail.com. Again, I'm an owner. We've set our tenant so that owners can invite. This will now initiate an invitation to Dux. Right? Dux will get an email, he'll have to redeem the email, all that kind of stuff. I did get a question.
By the way, there's another Dux. I don't have that Gmail account.
I know, it's gonna be fun to see who comes in. Remember, we had the question before of what does it look like if I try to add a restricted person? Let's try that. Dux.sci@avepoint.com. Hey, looks like I can do it, right? It's checking. Hey, wait a minute, something went wrong. So the message here, because AvePoint.com is on the deny list, isn't so graceful, right? And different interfaces have different ways of handling this in Office 365. But thus far, everything's working as expected. What I did, if you can remember this little PowerShell, is I went and I said, hey, treat retail differently than the rest. So now when I go in to my retail team, right? And I try to add that same member, john.at live.com. We know he's a member of the other one, but notice it doesn't now resolve, because as an owner, I'm not allowed to add guests to this team. So the bottom line here, Dux, is that especially groups and teams, there's a lot of power, but think about the complexity, right? All of this is great, but how do I operationalize this? Let's go one more level of complexity, and I'm going to go back to SharePoint. Just like Teams, SharePoint has the ability to have more granular settings. Now, there's something unique about SharePoint that you need to be aware of, unfortunately. And I apologize for this screenshot, but I went ahead and I Googled, I actually binged it with Google, but I binged redheaded stepchild, and this is what came up. So remember that that OneDrive for Business and SharePoint had external sharing before Azure AD B2B existed. So we're still in a place where SharePoint Online and OneDrive use a fundamentally different model for external sharing than what groups and teams do. And you're going to see that because you're going to see a lot of duplicated settings when I go into the SharePoint admin interfaces. You're going to see things like another allow deny list. Why? Because by default, SharePoint and OneDrive are not looking at Azure AD B2B, right? They're using their own set of external user definitions. And so if we go in here, you'll see that this can get a little complex, and I'll put you back together again at the end. So don't worry about it. So I'm in the SharePoint Admin Center, and the first thing I'm going to do is go look at this policies sharing. And remember what we set back in the Admin Center, the my M365 Admin Center? Sure enough, it's at the same point, right? New and existing guests. If I wanted to, I could adjust this slider, right? I could say, hey, wait a minute, in OneDrive, I only want people in my organization. So I can be more restrictive in OneDrives than in SharePoint. What I can't be is more restrictive in SharePoint than OneDrives. You notice it pulls it down there. So you can be more restrictive in OneDrives. You could say, hey, wait a minute, in shared spaces, I'll allow anonymous links, but in OneDrives, I won't. So you have a little bit of flexibility there. But where it really gets interesting is over here, right? And remember, these are just our global settings for all SharePoint sites, right? The starting point.
No, we have a good question here. So seeing this, right? So assuming, John, we're doing a one-on-one chat on Teams and you're a guest user and I share a OneDrive link with you, but then you set it up here only to the organization, the guests, when they click on it, they won't get to it.
Correct.
Because there's no relationship between the settings for Teams and
Correct. Yeah. Everything that has to, from a team perspective, all files are subject to these rules in SharePoint. That's why I remember when I tried to turn it on for groups and turn it off for SharePoint, I got the message that, hey, you've got a mismatch here, right?
So it says, are we Mac users doomed? A lot of these settings ask for software that is not available for Macs. Actually, no, all these settings are at on the Azure AD and Admin Center's browser based. So there's nothing direct to the client. So Mac users, you're not doomed. I have a Mac as well, so we're good.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move forward, right? So you see here again, limit sharing by domain, but you don't see my AvePoint domain in here, right? Again, separate settings because this is not Azure AD B2B. Now, one tip, if you want SharePoint to follow the rules that we've already set up for Azure B2B, you can bind it to existing guests only. So now you're saying SharePoint Online can only use guests that have already been added to the directory. The only thing you need to worry about there is make sure that you've got a process and a workflow to get them into the directory, right?
This is another important question. Do these settings apply only to straight up SharePoint sites, or does it apply to SharePoint sites in Teams as well?
Every SharePoint site. Yep, every SharePoint site. And so to prove that, let's leave here and let's go over to our active sites. And so you can see here, I have sites that are team sites, sites that are communication sites. So these are standalone, right? My drone workshop is a standalone site. And I also have sharing settings here down at the site by site level, right? And notice that my setting for this one site can be more restrictive because we're working on drones here, a lot of IP. We don't want to share that with other people. But I can't be less restrictive, right? This is grayed out because I can't be less restrictive than my global. So it is possible to be more restrictive on particular sites. Let me just go to this this Contoso site here, and let's look at the sharing settings there. So new and existing guests are the same here, right? They're at the organizational level. Let's go ahead and play with this. Let's go to this SharePoint site. And I don't know if I'm a guest or an owner here or not. Let me go ahead and change the ownership there real quick just to make myself an owner.
And friends, we really appreciate all your questions. Looks like every 2 minutes there's a question, or every minute. Obviously, we can't get to all of them. What we're going to do, we'll publish a blog post answering all these questions and pointing you to appropriate resources. So don't worry about it if we don't cover your questions, but this is very important, I know, for everyone.
Yep. And so this happens to be a group connected site. I'm going to add someone to the site only, right? Not to the group. And I'm going to add, guess who? Dux Sai at avepoint.com. Now, what would you expect would happen, Dux?
Yeah, it'll take me because this
It'll
is
take
share.
you because
Yeah,
this
you
is
didn't.
now using the SharePoint model. And we
Yeah,
did
you
not
didn't blacklist me. Right.
Yeah, we didn't limit ducks in SharePoint. We only limited in groups. So the bottom line here is there's a lot of complexity. And so let's go ahead and talk about some best practices and then ways forward, right?
Yeah.
So key considerations: guest access, external sharing. Who do you want to share with and where, right? Where meaning what applications? That's the first part of your strategy. Who? Is it a limited set of partners? Is it people from a limited set of domains? Or do you have a small subset of people that you don't want your users collaborating with? That's number one. That will allow you to set your allowed deny list. Where? This will allow you to say, do I want to share files? Do I want people to be in teams, right? That's the first question, who and where, right? You need to make that decision. That should be part of your policy. This is not technology yet. This is just decision points, right? The next one is, how should that onboarding process work? Do I want to allow my owners to bring net new guests in, yes or no, right? Because that's that one checkbox at the tenant level. Or do I want to have a process where they have to petition, let's say my operations team, to add any new guest? That's a much more secure way to go, but obviously a lot slower. And so you're risking that they're just going to start emailing or whatever. So how do you want to handle invitations? And then how do you want to handle the addition of guests, whether they be new or whether they be existing guests? Because that's another concern. Remember at the very beginning, Dux, we said there was this concern that you're going to get a guest in, you're going to let them in and they can go anywhere.
Hmm.
Well, if I allow across all my groups guests to be added by owners, I don't have any control about whether they get added to this team or that team, right? Now, there are some emerging technologies out there that are going to help with this. I'm going to show you what we do from AvePoint's perspective. Um, sensitivity labels at the group and team level may help with this. And then finally, what's the life cycle of guests? So
Yep.
we've spent a lot of time, right? There's nothing that'll get them in automatically, and there's other than the owner invitation flow, right? That's the only way to get them in the directory automatically, but there's nothing natively to get them out automatically. So let me show you a couple of things, Dux, that we've been working on in the AvePoint factory.
That's awesome. And I think a lot of people are asking this. Wow, this is really good, but I just want like a one-stop shop where not only can I configure all this, but be able to see everything. Like somebody's just asking now, is there one place where I could just see all my SharePoint site settings and users and whatnot?
Yeah.
Out of the box, I don't know of any way unless I
Right.
haven't checked the admin center recently.
Right, right. Yeah, there's no way to filter based off of those sharing settings or anything. So let's take a quick look here at what we're doing. So um, the first thing is, Dux, you know we have our AvePoint Cloud Governance solution, right? And this is all about allowing organizations to have some pre-packaged, no-code services that they can build. And some of those services are things like provisioning services for groups and teams and sites. When we do those provisioning services for groups and teams and sites, one of the things that you can do is you can go into the policy settings when you're building those services and decide for sites, groups, and teams that have this policy, how do you want to handle the groups and how do you want to handle the SharePoint sites? So this automates every time a new team or site or group gets created, how to apply those granular controls. No PowerShell, no messing around in the SharePoint Admin Center. And so this is a way for you to set up a scenario where, first off, I can have different external sharing settings for different departments, different purposes, and it's all just automated. There's nothing to do at the time of request. You plan all this ahead of time, and then we just decide who's allowed to see and request what services. We can put these things through approval if needed, you name it. The other thing that we can do is leverage some of the questionnaire capability that we have so that when users go to request new objects, right, we can ask them some business questions and guide them to some of these pre-configured services that are already protected in the appropriate way. So now we're not relying on admins to take manual actions. We're not relying on users to know the right thing to do. We're just sort of automating this stuff all the way through.
Yeah, and can you go back to the previous slide, John? I want to make a very important point here where
Sure.
you show the different departments.
Yep.
So this is important, right? We want to obviously serve the business needs. We can set up stuff at a tenant level, great, you know, Azure AD level, but then as you've seen, as we go down to the nitty-gritty details, well, sure, we can set it for departments, but as we know, different departments have different needs. Legal has a different need, marketing has a different need. Imagine configuring all this manually, as you've seen, as John has shown you, but not only configuring one time, but maintaining the configuration. Because look, Microsoft may introduce a new app, may introduce a new feature. Some of the models may change as a result of these new technology. So that's a challenging piece.
Absolutely. And so that's great for configuring the sharing settings on the workspace when I create it. But what about that onboarding of the guest user to begin with? What if I'm uncomfortable with the owner invitation flow because it's a little too loose for me, but I don't want to go to such a stranglehold where IT has to evaluate and add every guest user? So what we added earlier this year, Dux, was the concept of a guest user provisioning request. So in this case, and this is the admin configuration of it, a couple things we're doing. For every guest that gets requested, there is going to be a primary and a secondary sponsor, right? These are the responsible parties for this. So it's like you can come to the party, but you got to have a chaperone, right? And so every guest will have a primary and a secondary chaperone. Also, the guests will be subject to what we call a renewal policy, which can be triggered on a periodic basis. So I can say I need Dux from AvePoint in. We can put that through an approval process. You can ask my manager. IT doesn't necessarily need to be involved, but they can be. We have all these conditional approvals. But then once the approvals are granted, the guest is automatically added to the directory. And then based on the settings for the guest user request process that that generated their membership, they will have to, on a periodic basis, these responsible parties will have to execute what we call a renewal process. And here's a quick example of the renewal process, in which case I simply step through and confirm that, yes, I do want to still sponsor Tom. I get presented with the groups and teams that Tom is a member of. I can see the responsible parties for those workspaces. If I wanted to, I could remove Tom from those groups or teams. If I wanted to, I could remove Tom from the organization as a whole, right? And what this gives me is one of those, again, periodic processes that will force, is it okay? Is it okay? Is it okay? So this is kind of the softer way to do that review. We have an associated process here for admins to always be able to see every guest user and what workspaces they're a part of, when their renewal is pending, and who are the answerable parties. So by having this sort of managed process for onboarding and a managed process for reviewing the guests, we're solving a couple of big parts of this process.
This is very critical. I just want to really step back and kind of unpack every single thing that you just described here, right? First and foremost, through cloud governance, we can configure all the policies, what guest users can do and cannot do. So that's great. That's at the IT level. Yep. But then also we can bake in all the policies for different departments. So from an end user perspective, they can interact with you directly in Teams. So you're looking at Teams. This is our app called MyHub. So an end user can request, hey, I want to invite dux@gmail.com. So the end user can do it here. And based on policies, oh, Dux is from marketing, he could do it, right? Or another person, John from legal, is requesting, well, John's from legal, there are policies that his boss has to approve it first. All this will be automated. And if you're already using ServiceNow, somebody here says we're using ServiceNow, this integrates with ServiceNow as well. So it can flow in through your IT lifecycle, IT delivery management process as well. So there are different entry points for your end user to request. But the cool thing is, once they request, it's not just sitting on somebody's task list in IT. All the policies will kick in and be enforced.
Yep. And then the last mile of this is great, right? There's now a managed process to get these guests in. I'm still concerned about getting them out though, right? And so that's where I'm really excited about what we released back in September, which is part of our policies and insights application, which is a companion application to the cloud governance one we just looked at. And what I can do here, amongst many other things, is I can set some policies around guest users, ghost users, and inactive users. So what this will allow me to do is say, hey, watch over my tenant, and if I have users who are no longer guests, who are no longer part of any SharePoint sites, groups, or teams, go ahead and delete them. So basically, there's no need for them to be in the directory anymore. Clean them out. And it's an automated process. Obviously, we can notify people. You can decide that you don't want to automatically do the deletion, but just flag it up as an alert. So it's really up to you, but this is super powerful because it's that last mile of automated detection that maybe someone's in here that shouldn't. The inactive guests is different, right? It's if the guest doesn't show any activity in my tenant, right? They haven't touched a file, they haven't left a message, they haven't done anything for a predetermined period of time. Similarly, we can prune them out automatically, right? Or take a slightly less heavy-handed approach and just flag it as an alert, right? So again, now we have managed onboarding of guest users. I have a fully managed process for where guests are allowed to collaborate and where they're not. Same thing on SharePoint side, where externals are allowed and they're not. And now I have that end of life process where I can automatically remove people as guests if they don't seem to be needed anymore. So we're a little bit over time. Dux, any other cool questions here that we can rip off real quickly?
Yeah, so I just want to wrap up. First of all, thank you for your interest. We've got over 80 questions. We're gonna definitely put together a blog series. A couple last questions. So just to clarify what you said, John, it's like, so sounds like AvePoint covers the whole guest user lifecycle, onboarding, reviewing, renewing, and offboarding as well. The answer is yes, and definitely we're gonna send a follow up. Would love to show you how we do that in detail. And somebody's also asked, can you align business policies to business
Great
function
question.
organization?
Great
Absolutely.
question. Yeah, that slide showed divisions, but it could just as easily be roles, responsibilities, only allow management to request guests, right? You could have all kinds, no matter how you want to do it, you can do it. And the way you would do it is simply use the ability in cloud governance to audience target certain service request types at certain parts of your population. So very flexible.
So with that, before we wrap up, what do you guys think? Pop in the chat your feedback. Great, not great. John's hair's too long. Whatever feedback you give us, we would love it. But we appreciate you jumping on. And if you want more of this, I know 1 hour is goes by very fast. We'd be happy to do it. If you want us to do a workshop for your organization, we do this regularly for a lot of companies. We spend half day, whole day unpacking what Microsoft offers, and at the same time can talk to you about how we can help bridge if there's any gap for you. So with that, thank you everybody. Have a phenomenal day. Take care. Wear your mask. Wash your hand. And John, always good to spend time with you.
Yep, always good to have you as a partner in crime here, Dux. And we will, as you say, make an effort to get to the questions that we didn't answer online in a follow-up blog series. So thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you next time.